For more than 30 years, two neighbors lived side by side, and for just as long they pretended the other did not exist. They shared the same street, the same changing seasons, and the same old wooden fence. But somewhere along the way, a single night turned into decades of silence. No one asked what really happened. No one tried to fix it. Until one summer, a young girl crossed a line she was never warned about, and uncovered a truth that would force two old men to face the one thing they had avoided for years: the cost of never speaking at all. In a quiet suburban neighborhood where the streets curved gently and the houses all seemed to follow the same familiar pattern, there stood two homes side by side. They were modest houses built decades ago with wide front porches and low-pitched roofs. Nothing about them suggested conflict. From the outside, they looked like any two neighboring homes in a small American town. Quiet, ordinary, and settled into the slow rhythm of life. Between them ran an old wooden fence. It wasn't tall and it wasn't strong. The paint had peeled away long ago, leaving the wood faded and rough. In places, the boards leaned slightly as if they were tired of standing upright after so many years. Grass grew unevenly along its base, and weeds pushed through the cracks where the soil had softened. The fence had been there for as long as anyone could remember. So had the silence. On the left lived Walter Harris. Walter was 73 years old, a widower who had lived in that house for most of his adult life. He was a quiet man, the kind who woke early, brewed his coffee slowly, and sat alone at the kitchen table listening to the morning news. His movements were careful and deliberate, shaped by age and habit rather than haste. On the right lived Robert Miller. Robert was 75, retired, and known in the neighborhood for keeping his lawn trimmed just a little shorter than everyone else's. He had a strong voice even now, and a posture that suggested he was not used to backing down. He spent most afternoons on his front porch watching the street as if it were his responsibility to keep an eye on things. Walter and Robert had lived next to each other for over 30 years. And yet, they lived as though the other did not exist. If Walter stepped outside to take out the trash and saw Robert already in his yard, he would pause. Sometimes he would turn back, pretending he had forgotten something inside. Other times he would wait, standing still until Robert went back, indoors. Robert did the same. If their paths crossed by accident, at the mailbox or near the edge of the fence, the air between them tightened immediately. Their shoulders stiffened, their faces hardened. Sometimes words were exchanged, not many. Never loud, never dramatic, just sharp, cold remarks thrown quickly and without warmth. Enough to remind both men why they preferred silence. Most of the time, though, they avoided each other completely. The neighborhood had grown used to it. People who had lived there for years barely noticed anymore. New neighbors might ask once or twice why the two men never spoke. The answers were always vague. They've had a falling out. It's been that way forever. Best not to get involved. No one remembered exactly how it started. Some thought it had to do with property lines. Others guessed money, or an argument from long ago that had grown larger with time. But decades had passed, and the original reason had faded into something less important than the silence itself. At some point, the silence became normal. Children who grew up on that street learned early that the two houses were separate worlds. Delivery drivers noticed it. Dog walkers sensed it. There was an invisible boundary there, stronger than the old wooden fence that no one crossed without feeling it. Walter felt it every morning, He would stand at his kitchen window, cup of coffee in hand, looking out toward the fence. Sometimes he saw movement on the other side, Robert bending over his flower beds or stepping onto the porch with a newspaper tucked under his arm. Walter would look away, not out of fear, not out of anger, out of habit. Robert felt it too. He noticed which days Walter took the trash out early and which days he waited. He knew which side of the driveway Walter preferred to walk on. He noticed these things without meaning to, the way people notice familiar landmarks, and each time he felt the same tightness in his chest. The unspoken question that had followed him for years: why had it ended this way? Neither man talked about it, not to neighbors, not to friends, not even to themselves, not in clear words. The story had been buried under years of routine, pride, and unanswered thoughts. The fence remained, weathered, quiet, unchanged. It stood as a reminder, not of what had happened, but of how long it had been since anything was said. In the evenings, as the sun dipped low and the street grew quiet, the two houses settled into their separate silences. Porch lights flickered on, one after the other, but never together. The sound of a television might drift from one side while the other stayed dark. Life went on that way, day after day, year after year, until one summer, until a child arrived, and with her, a presence small enough to slip through spaces adults had learned not to see. But for now, the neighborhood remained exactly as it had been. Two houses, one fence, and a silence so old that no one questioned it anymore. No one, that is, except the silence itself. Summer arrived quietly in the neighborhood the way it often did. The mornings grew longer. The air became warmer, heavier, and filled with the soft hum of cicadas. Lawns turned greener and the street seemed to slow down, as if everyone had agreed without saying so that there was no need to rush anymore. It was at the beginning of that summer that Emily Miller came to stay with her grandfather. Emily was 7 years old, small for her age, with curious eyes that noticed things adults had learned to overlook. She arrived with a single suitcase, a worn backpack, and a dog who stayed close enough to brush against her legs whenever she stopped walking. The dog's name was Buddy. Buddy was an old golden retriever, his fur lighter than it once had been, his steps slower but steady. He moved with the calm confidence of a dog who had known many homes, many seasons, and many quiet afternoons. Wherever Emily went, Buddy followed. Robert Miller welcomed his granddaughter with careful attention. He prepared the guest room days in advance. He stocked the refrigerator with Emily's favorite snacks. He walked slower when she held his hand, and he checked the doors twice every night before going to bed. To Robert, summer meant responsibility. Emily, however, saw it as freedom. She spent her days exploring the yard, drawing shapes in the dirt with a stick, and talking to Buddy as if he were capable of answering back. She noticed things immediately: the way the sunlight fell through the trees, the creak of the porch steps, and most of all the fence between the two houses. The old wooden fence fascinated her. It wasn't tall enough to block her view completely, and the boards were spaced just far enough apart for her to peer through. On the other side lay another yard, quiet and tidy, with patches of shade beneath a large, aging tree stump near the back. Each time Emily drifted too close to it, Robert's voice would reach her from the porch. "Never go near that fence," he warned. Not angry, not loud, just firm. Not even close. Emily nodded every time. She didn't ask why. Children often accept boundaries long before they understand them, but curiosity has a way of waiting. One afternoon, the heat settled in early. Robert went inside to rest, leaving Emily in the yard with Buddy. The air was still and the street was quiet enough to hear the distant sound of a lawnmower several houses away. Buddy wandered near the fence. At first, Emily didn't notice. She was busy lining up small stones along the edge of the porch. When she looked up, Buddy was gone. Then she heard it, a soft rustling followed by a low, uncertain whine. Emily stood. She walked toward the fence, her steps slow, cautious. She saw Buddy's tail through a narrow gap, wagging once before disappearing completely. Buddy had slipped through a broken section near the bottom of the fence. For a moment, Emily froze. She remembered her grandfather's voice, the warning, the firmness. But Buddy was on the other side. Without thinking any further, she dropped to her knees and pushed her way through the loose boards. The fence scraped against her arms as she climbed through, landing softly in the neighboring yard. She had crossed the line. Emily expected to feel scared. Instead, she felt quiet. The yard was calm, shaded, and still. The grass was neatly trimmed and a gentle breeze stirred the leaves overhead. Buddy stood a few steps away, stuck between the fence and a thick bush, his tail wagging apologetically. Emily moved quickly to free him. It was then that she noticed someone else in the yard. A man was kneeling near the back of the house. She recognized him immediately. Walter Harris. Emily stayed where she was, holding Buddy's collar, her heart beating faster. She had heard her grandfather mention Walter before. Not often, and never kindly. She had expected something different. Walter wasn't angry, he wasn't shouting, he wasn't even looking in her direction. He was focused on a small cardboard box placed gently on the ground beside him. Inside the box was a kitten. It was small and thin, its fur matted, its movements weak. Walter spoke to it in a low voice, steady and calm as he carefully set down a small bowl of water. He moved slowly as if afraid to startle the animal. Emily watched, unmoving. This was not the man she had imagined. Walter's hands were gentle, his posture relaxed. There was patience in the way he waited for the kitten to drink, in the way he shielded it from the sun with his own shadow. Buddy sat beside Emily, quiet now, his tail resting on the grass. For several moments no one spoke. Then Walter noticed movement. He turned, saw Emily standing near the fence, and froze. There was no anger in his expression, only surprise. Emily felt the weight of the moment settle around her. She had crossed into a space she was never meant to enter, and she knew it. Without saying a word, she clipped Buddy's leash back on and backed slowly toward the fence. She climbed through, heart racing, and stood on her own side again. Only then did she run. That evening, Emily sat at the kitchen table while Robert prepared dinner. Buddy lay at her feet asleep. She told her grandfather what she had seen. She spoke carefully, choosing her words the way children do when they sense something important. She told him about the kitten, about the way Walter moved, about how gentle he had been. Robert stopped what he was doing. For a moment, something hard passed across his face. His jaw tightened and his shoulders stiffened. Then he turned back to the stove. After a long silence, he spoke, not sharply, not kindly, just heavily. The words that followed would open a door Emily hadn't known existed, a door that led back many years to a night neither man had ever truly left behind. That evening the house felt quieter than usual. The sun had already set, leaving behind a soft orange glow that lingered just above the rooftops. The kitchen lights were on, but the warmth they cast did little to ease the heaviness that had settled in the room. Emily sat at the table, her feet swinging just above the floor. Buddy lay curled beside her chair, breathing slowly, unaware of the weight his afternoon adventure had stirred. Robert stood at the counter, his back turned. Emily told her story again carefully this time. She spoke about the fence, the kitten, and the way Walter Harris had knelt in the grass as if the small animal mattered more than anything else around him. She did not exaggerate. She did not accuse. She simply described what she had seen. Robert's reaction came quickly. His shoulders stiffened, his hands stopped moving. For a moment, the air between them felt tight, sharp with something unspoken. He turned halfway toward Emily, his expression hard. That man, he said, was not who she thought he was. The words were firm, final. Emily fell silent, but children have a way of noticing what adults try to hide. She saw the way her grandfather's jaw tightened, the way his eyes briefly lost focus as if they were no longer looking at the kitchen wall but at something far away. After a long pause, Robert sighed. The anger drained from his face, leaving behind something heavier, something older. He pulled out a chair and sat down across from Emily. Buddy lifted his head briefly, then settled again. Robert did not look at his granddaughter as he began to speak. Instead, he stared at the tabletop, at a faint scratch in the wood that had been there longer than Emily herself. It happened a long time ago, he said. So long ago that most people had forgotten, but he hadn't. He told her that once, many years before, he and Walter Harris had been good neighbors. More than that, they had been friends, the kind of friends who borrowed tools without asking and watched each other's houses without being told. They had shared meals, laughed together, helped each other through ordinary days. Back then, the fence hadn't meant anything at all. Then came the storm. Robert's voice slowed as he described that night. The rain had started suddenly, pounding against the windows with a force that shook the house. The wind had howled through the neighborhood, bending trees and tearing branches loose. Power lines went down. The streetlights flickered and went dark. It was the kind of storm people remembered for years. In the middle of the night, a loud crack split the air. The old oak tree that stood between the two houses, massive and weathered, had finally given way. Its roots tore free from the ground, and the tree fell crashing toward Robert's yard. It landed hard. The sound was unmistakable. When Robert ran outside, soaked by the rain, he saw the damage immediately. The tree had crushed part of his fence and landed near the small structure where his dog slept. His dog. Robert paused there, his voice faltering. The dog had been with him for years. Loyal, protective, always waiting by the door. That night, the animal had been trapped beneath fallen branches, injured badly. Robert did everything he could. He carried the dog inside, wrapped it in blankets, stayed up through the night listening to the storm and hoping. But hope faded slowly day by day. The dog grew weaker, quieter. And then one morning it did not wake up at all. Emily listened without interrupting. She could feel the sadness in her grandfather's words, the way grief still lingered beneath the surface even after all those years. But it wasn't just the loss that had hurt him. It was what came after. In the days following the storm, Robert waited. He expected Walter to come over, to ask how things were, to say something, anything. But Walter's house stayed quiet. The curtains remained drawn, the door never opened. No knock came. No words were exchanged. To Robert, the silence felt intentional. He told Emily that each passing day made the quiet heavier, the grief sharper, the unanswered questions harder to ignore. Eventually, anger took root. One morning, still raw with loss and frustration, Robert went outside with a saw. He cut away every part of the fallen tree that lay on his side of the fence. He worked quickly, fueled by resentment, leaving the thick stump behind on Walter's property. That, he said, was the moment everything ended. After that day, there were no more conversations, no shared glances, no attempts to fix what had broken. The fence became a boundary instead of a suggestion. Robert finished his story and leaned back in his chair. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Emily looked down at Buddy at the slow rise and fall of his chest. She thought about the kitten she had seen that afternoon, about Walter's careful hands, about the quiet patience she had witnessed. Something didn't fit. She didn't say that out loud, but the feeling stayed with her. The story explained the anger. It explained the distance. It explained why her grandfather warned her away from the fence. And yet, it left behind a question that refused to settle. If Walter Harris had truly been so cold, so indifferent, then why had he knelt in the grass for a frightened kitten? Emily looked up at her grandfather. Robert's eyes were tired now. Older than before. This was his truth, the version of the past he had carried alone for years. Emily nodded, accepting his words, but her mind remained unsettled. Outside, the night deepened. The old fence stood quietly between the two houses, unchanged, holding its secrets the way it always had. And somewhere beneath the silence, something waited, unfinished, unresolved, and still very much alive. Emily lay awake for a long time that night. The house was quiet. Her grandfather had gone to bed early, exhausted by the memories he had finally spoken aloud. Buddy slept at the foot of her bed, his breathing slow and steady, as comforting as a ticking clock. But Emily could not sleep. Robert's story replayed itself in her mind, the storm, the fallen tree, the injured dog, and the silence that followed. It explained so much. It explained the anger, the fence, the warnings, and yet something about it did not sit right with her. Emily had seen Walter Harris with her own eyes. She had seen the way he handled the kitten, the care in his movements, the patience in the way he waited. That was not the behavior of a man who did not care. It was not the behavior of someone who would turn away without concern. The next morning, Emily made a decision. She didn't tell her grandfather. After breakfast, while Robert settled into his chair with the newspaper, Emily clipped Buddy's leash and walked toward the far end of the yard. The old fence stood exactly where it always had, quiet and unassuming. This time, Emily did not hesitate. She guided Buddy toward the back corner where the ground dipped slightly and the remains of the old oak tree still sat, weathered and forgotten. The stump was wide and darkened with age, its surface rough beneath her fingers. Buddy sniffed the ground, his nose moving slowly, deliberately. Then he began to dig. At first, Emily thought he was just playing. But Buddy didn't stop. His paws worked at the dirt with focus, scraping away loose soil near the base of the stump. Emily crouched beside him. As the dirt cleared, something pale and frayed appeared beneath the surface. Emily brushed it with her hand. It was rope. Old rope. The fibers were brittle, weakened by years of rain and sun, but unmistakable. It lay half-buried, wrapped loosely around the base of the stump, trailing off toward the fence line. Emily's heart began to beat faster. Buddy continued digging, uncovering more of the ground. Emily leaned closer and saw something else, marks in the wood itself. Deep grooves cut into the base of the stump, angled and uneven as if made in haste. axe marks. Emily traced them with her fingers. They were old, weathered, but they were there. Someone had chopped at this tree. Emily stood slowly, her gaze following the line of the rope, then the direction of the cuts. She imagined the tree standing tall years ago, its weight balanced between the two houses. And then she imagined it beginning to fall, not straight down, not randomly, but guided, redirected. Emily felt a chill move through her. The tree had not fallen the way it did by accident. Someone had been here that night. Someone had acted. Emily stepped back, looking at the stump with new eyes. It was no longer just a remnant of an old storm. It was evidence, a quiet witness that had been waiting all these years. She thought about her grandfather, about the anger in his voice, about the grief he had carried alone. She thought about Walter Harris, about the silence that followed the storm, about the years of distance that had grown from something never explained. Emily understood something then with a clarity that surprised her. Adults often carried their pain like a shield, and sometimes they hid behind it for so long that they forgot how to lower it. Emily clipped Buddy's leash again and led him back through the fence. She did not say a word to her grandfather when she returned to the house. She spent the rest of the day quietly thinking. By evening, she had a plan. It wasn't complicated. It didn't involve words or accusations. It relied on something simple. Fear. Not the kind that harms, but the kind that breaks habits. The kind that makes people act before thinking. The next afternoon, when the sun sat high and the street lay empty in the heat, Emily waited until Robert stepped inside to answer a phone call. She slipped out the back door with Buddy and crossed the yard quickly. This time she climbed the fence deliberately, landing on Walter Harris's side. She moved just far enough that her grandfather could no longer see her. Then she screamed. It was loud, sharp, high-pitched, not playful, not dramatic, real enough. Robert heard it instantly. The phone dropped. The front door slammed open. Panic erased years of caution in a single heartbeat. He ran, without stopping, without thinking. He crossed the yard, reached the fence, and climbed it in a way he hadn't done in decades. Buddy barked once and pulled toward the back of the yard, leading Robert straight to the old oak stump. Robert froze. He saw the disturbed soil, the rope, the axe marks. For a long moment he stood there, breathing hard, staring at the ground as if it were something alive. Then he sank slowly to his knees. The anger that had carried him for years drained away, replaced by confusion, by doubt, by something close to regret. Behind him, a door opened. Walter Harris stood a few steps away, leaning heavily on his cane. His hair was thinner now, his face more lined, but his eyes were clear. He looked at Robert, and then he looked at the stump. Walter sighed. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was full of memory, of effort, of a night long past. Walter spoke quietly. He explained that on the night of the storm, Robert had been asleep, exhausted, unaware. Walter had seen the tree beginning to lean toward Robert's house, toward the weak structure and the dog shelter. He hadn't had time to wake anyone, so he had acted. He had taken his axe, weakened the base, and tied rope to pull the tree's fall away from the house. Robert's dog had barked, pulled, stayed with him through the storm. They had worked until dawn. After that night, Walter had fallen ill. Fever had kept him inside for days, and by the time he recovered, the damage to the tree, to the dog, to the friendship had already been done. Walter hadn't spoken because he hadn't known how. And then, after the anger, he hadn't known if it mattered anymore. Robert listened. The truth settled heavily between them. Emily stood quietly beside Buddy, watching as something long frozen finally began to thaw. The tree had remembered, and now, at last, so did they. Robert Miller did not remember climbing the fence. Later, when he tried to recall that moment, all he could remember was the sound of Emily's scream, sharp, sudden, and filled with fear. It cut through the afternoon heat and tore straight through years of habit, pride, and restraint. He reacted before his mind could catch up. The newspaper slipped from his hands. The chair tipped backward. His heart pounded as he ran across the yard toward the fence he had not crossed in years. His body moved faster than his thoughts, driven by something older and stronger than anger. Concern. He climbed the fence awkwardly, scraping his arm, landing hard on the other side. Buddy barked once and pulled forward, leading him toward the back of the yard. Robert followed. That was when he saw it. The old oak stump, the disturbed soil around it, the frayed rope half buried in the dirt, the deep angled marks carved into the wood. He stopped breathing for a moment. The world seemed to narrow until there was nothing left but the ground beneath his feet and the truth rising slowly, painfully, into view. Those marks were not random. They were not the result of decay or time. They were deliberate. Someone had struck that tree. Someone had weakened it. Someone had tried to control how it fell. Robert sank to his knees. The anger that had carried him for so many years finally gave way to something else. Confusion, followed by doubt, followed by a heavy, sinking realization. Behind him, the screen door creaked open. Walter Harris stepped into the yard. He moved slowly now, leaning on a cane, his frame thinner than it had once been. Age had softened him, carved lines into his face, but his eyes were steady. Clear. He looked at Robert kneeling by the stump, then at the rope, then at the marks in the wood. For a long moment neither man spoke. The silence between them was different now. It was no longer empty or sharp. It was full of memory, of effort, of years of things left unsaid. Walter took a slow breath. Then quietly he told the truth. On the night of the storm, Robert had been asleep, exhausted. He had been drinking earlier that evening, and the sound of the rain and wind had never reached him. Walter had been awake. He had seen the oak tree begin to shift, its roots pulling loose, its weight turning dangerously toward Robert's house, toward the old structure, toward the place where Robert's dog slept. There had been no time to knock, no time to wake anyone. So Walter had acted. He took his axe and struck the base of the tree, not to fell it completely, but to weaken it, just enough. He tied rope around the trunk and pulled, guiding the direction of its fall. The storm raged around him, and Robert's dog had been there. The animal had barked, then pulled at the rope, adding its weight, staying beside Walter through the wind and rain. Together, man and dog had fought the storm, straining until the tree finally came down, away from the house, away from the weakest part of the yard. When morning came, Walter was soaked, shaking, and exhausted. He went home, changed his clothes, and collapsed into bed with a fever that lasted days. By the time he recovered, the tree had been cut away, the fence rebuilt, and Robert's grief had already hardened into anger. Walter never explained. At first he was too weak, then too hurt, and eventually too proud. He believed Robert would never listen, that the truth no longer mattered, that the silence was easier than reopening the wound. Robert listened without interruption. The weight of the years pressed down on him as the story unfolded. Each word filled a space he had carried empty for far too long. He thought of his dog, the loyalty, the strength, the quiet courage he had never fully understood. He thought of Walter, sick and alone, lying in bed while resentment grew just a few steps away. And he thought of himself, of how quickly he had chosen anger over understanding. Emily stood nearby, holding Buddy's leash. She watched her grandfather's shoulders sag, watched something in him finally break, not in defeat but in release. Robert stood slowly. His voice, when he spoke, was unsteady. He told Walter he had been wrong. He told him he should have asked, should have listened, should have walked across the yard instead of cutting ties with a saw and years of silence. Walter nodded once. No dramatic gestures followed, no speeches, no absolution offered or demanded, just understanding. In the days that followed, small things changed. Robert returned to the stump with tools, this time not in anger but with purpose. Walter joined him. Together they worked in silence, removing what remained of the old oak piece by piece. The fence came down next, not all of it, just enough. In its place they built a small gate. Robert brought flowers. Walter planted them carefully along the edges. By the end of the week, something new stood where the barrier had once been, a simple opening framed by color and care. In the evenings, they sat in the yard together. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't. It no longer mattered. Emily played nearby with Buddy, her laughter light against the quiet hum of the neighborhood. Walter's cat lay stretched in the shade while Buddy rested close by, tails occasionally brushing as if acknowledging one another's presence. Two animals, two men, at peace. The houses still stood side by side, the fence was still there, but the silence was gone. What had ended their friendship had not been the storm, or the tree, or even the loss. It had been what was never said. And now, at last, it had been.